June 6, 1944, Pointe du Hoc, Normandy. It was meant as a joke. Goering's bold promise that the Atlantic Wall could never be breached. But on this cold dawn, that boast hung over the French coast like a curse. Pointe du Hoc, a fortress of concrete and steel perched 100 feet above a raging sea, stood as its proud symbol. From the German trenches, the cliffs looked unassailable, the waves below an eternal moat. The garrison believed they were Europe's final shield, safe behind an impossible wall. Yet within hours, that illusion would collapse. The defense they trusted would face an assault that defied every rule of war. The impossible climb at Pointe du Hoc, an act of courage so unlikely that its success would make D-Day itself possible. A gray mist clings to the headland. The wind carries the brine of the channel and the deep rhythmic pulse of distant surf. The bunkers hum with a quiet tension, the kind that settles when nothing has happened for too long. German sentries stand watch above the cliffs, their silhouettes framed against the paling sky. The night has been restless but uneventful. Like every night for weeks, they whisper of an invasion, but it always seems to belong to some other coast, some other hour. Beneath the hard concrete domes lie the great guns, French-made. 155mm GPFs, captured in 1940. Each rests within a case made of reinforced steel and stone, their barrels commanding the channel. Around them stretches a maze of trenches, observation posts and mortar pits. Ammunition is stacked in dry chambers. Range maps hang from the bunker walls. Telephone lines snake between command posts, connecting Pointe du Hoc to the wider Atlantic Wall network. The men who serve here have come to believe in their fortress. To them, these cliffs are nature's ally. Walls of rock that no man could climb. Waves that batter the base like a moat. Tides that could drown an army. They have been told again and again that they are impregnable, that if the Allies dare to come, they will break themselves against the cliffs. Inside a command post, Feldwebel Dieter Müller unfolds a weather report from Cherbourg. The forecast is poor. Heavy surf, high winds, limited visibility. He nods in quiet satisfaction. The Atlantic Wall, he thinks, could not ask for a better ally. The officers share a cigarette, speaking in half sentences, their confidence tinged with boredom. Hours earlier, from Berlin, came another message. That the Allies had been deceived by the great ruse at Pas de Calais, expecting the blow to fall far to the northeast. The real Normandy defenses, they say, will face only small diversionary raids. Müller repeats that phrase to himself, small raids, as though it is a charm. Outside, Obergefreiter Karl Rettig paces the trench line. Rifle slung across his shoulder, he peers out to sea, seeing only fog and the faint white gleam of breaking surf. For weeks he has done the same, morning, noon, and night. The same gray horizon, the same wind off the water. There is little to do but wait and imagine what lies beyond it. He knows of the Allied bombing campaign, of the endless convoys that cross from England, of the propaganda leaflets promising liberation, but none of it seems real here. Pointe du Hoc feels forgotten by the war, sealed in its own stillness. Somewhere deep in the earth beneath his boots, a generator hums to life. The faint smell of diesel mingles with sea salt and damp stone. The sound is comforting, mechanical, predictable. Yet beyond the fog, beyond the edge of sight, history is assembling. Over 5,000 ships, transports, destroyers, cruisers, landing craft are gathering on the channel. On their decks wait 150,000 men. The greatest invasion force in human history. The first hint comes not by sight but by sound. A low vibration, at first mistaken for wind, then a steady thunder, like a storm that refuses to fade. Reddy turns, frowning toward the sea. Artillery? Someone mutters. Another shakes his head. The sound grows louder, nearer, until the horizon itself seems to tremble. Officers rush to the observation posts. Rangefinders are adjusted, binoculars raised. Then as the dawn lightens, the fog begins to thin, and the unimaginable comes into view. The horizon is filled with shadows, dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of them. Ships, vast and small, so dense they merge into a single moving wall. The sea itself has become a machine. For a moment the defenders simply stare. Even through their disbelief, they grasp the scale of it. A fleet larger than anything the world has seen. Engines rumble like thunder across the water. Columns of smoke rise from the horizon. Somewhere among those waves are men, thousands of them, and they are coming straight for Normandy. Rettig feels his pulse quicken. The officers shout orders. The range tables are consulted. Telephones crackle with static as reports surge up the chain of command. Farther along the coast, Other strong points call in identical sightings. The invasion has come, here, not at Calais, not in Norway, but here, on this forgotten strip of French coast. Then suddenly the world explodes. The first shells come from the sea, naval guns firing from miles offshore. Each round screams through the air like an express train before smashing into the headland. The bunkers tremble, the air fills with dust and smoke. Concrete shatters, the earth convulses, the defenders press themselves against the walls. Ears ringing, hearts pounding, the bombardment becomes a rhythm. Shells, shock, silence, then another detonation closer than before. Through the periscope slit of a bunker, Rudder glimpses the coastline below. The surf is white with fury. Spray climbs halfway up the cliffs. The sea looks like chaos itself, yet through that chaos, something moves. Small craft, dozens of them, bobbing violently in the waves, crawling toward the base of the cliff. He squints through the haze. At first he cannot understand what he's seeing. Then the realization comes, cold and unbelievable. Figures, men, are leaping from those boats into the surf. They are burdened with gear, grappling hooks, ladders, ropes. They are running toward the cliff. The German guns open up. Machine gun fire rattles from the embrasures. Mortars thump from the trenches. The air fills with tracers and smoke. Still, the men below keep moving, vanishing into the spray. Reappearing at the cliff's base, Rudder shouts to his comrades. Voice lost in the din. They're climbing! The words sound absurd even as he says them. No one could climb those cliffs. Not under this fire, not under this bombardment. And yet, through the smoke and shrapnel he sees it. Ropes rising from the surf. Men scaling the rock face hand over hand. Grappling for footholds in the slick stone. The impossible is happening. Above them, the defenders fire, reload, throw grenades down the cliffs, shouting to one another in disbelief. But the men below do not stop even as their ropes burn. Even as bullets tear through the air, they keep climbing. In that moment, the fortress that once felt eternal begins to tremble. Not from the bombardment, but from the realization that something unthinkable is taking shape below. The impossible climb has begun. Pointe du Hoc was never meant to fall. It was the crown jewel of the Atlantic Wall, a bastion carved from the bones of the French coast, commanding the sea between Omaha and Utah Beach. From its summit, German observers could see for miles in every direction. The faint curve of the coastline, the restless shimmer of the channel, and on clear days, even the distant shimmer of ships far out to sea. It was to its garrison more than a defensive post. It was a statement of permanence, of German mastery over Europe's western edge. The strong point was built with precision, even elegance. Its casemates were poured from hundreds of tons of concrete, reinforced with iron and stone, designed to withstand anything short of a direct naval shell. 6 French GPF guns, 155 millimeters in caliber, sat in semicircular emplacements, their arcs of fire overlapping to cover both American beaches. Their fields of vision reached deep into the channel, 20 kilometers out to sea. Beneath the surface, tunnels and ammunition bunkers crisscrossed like veins. Electric cables connected observation posts to firing centers, to telephone exchanges, to radar installations farther inland. To the Germans it felt unassailable. The cliffs themselves rose like a natural wall, sheer, jagged, and slick with salt water. The engineers who built the defenses joked that even mountain goats would refuse to climb them. Atop this natural fortress, they added layer upon layer of man-made death. Barbed wire in 3 concentric belts, mines buried among the rocks, and machine guns sighted to sweep every inch of open ground. And yet the greatest weapon here was belief. The men of the 352nd Infantry Division, who occupied this outpost, had been told for months that the Atlantic Wall would make any invasion suicidal. Berlin promised that even if the Allies came, they would die on the beaches. In training pamphlets, propaganda films, and radio broadcasts, they heard it again and again. The wall was invincible. Inside the bunkers, life followed a slow rhythm. Sentries rotated every 2 hours. Maintenance crews cleaned the guns, adjusted the rangefinders, logged ammunition counts. At midday, coffee was brewed over small stoves. Men smoked and wrote letters home, describing boredom more than battle. A few had grown almost resentful of the monotony. They were soldiers, after all, trained for action. Yet the only enemy they saw was the sea. They called Pointe du Hoc the Eagle's Nest, though most joked it was more like a prison. Supplies came by truck from Grand Camp, bringing bread, tinned meat, and fresh uniforms. Occasionally, French farmers were brought in to repair damage from winter storms. The men grew accustomed to the rhythm. the wind that howled through the embrasures at night, the smell of oil, the sting of salt in every breath. Still, there were reminders of danger. Allied aircraft passed high overhead almost daily, their contrails gliding like chalk lines across the sky. Sometimes British bombers struck the cliffs. Testing their accuracy, the sound was terrifying. The whine of bombs slicing through air, then the crash and tremor that followed. Yet when the dust cleared, the bunkers stood firm. It became almost a point of pride. Nothing the Allies tried could break them. What the garrison did not know, what Berlin itself barely understood, was that their fortress was already obsolete. In the spring of 1944, Allied intelligence had identified Pointe du Hoc as one of the most dangerous artillery positions in France. From these cliffs, those 6 guns could sweep both main invasion beaches, delivering plunging fire that would tear landing craft to pieces before they reached shore. Destroying them had become an obsession for the Allied planners. Months before D-Day, the British and Americans had begun studying the site from aerial reconnaissance photographs. They knew the guns had been mounted in casemates, but they also noticed something curious. In May, the guns appeared to have been moved, perhaps into nearby fields or camouflaged pits. It was unclear where they were now, or if the Germans had replaced them with decoys. Still, the position had to be neutralized. The task fell to an elite group of American soldiers, the 2nd and 5th Ranger Battalions, under Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder. Their mission was simple on paper: land at the base of Pointe du Hoc, climb the cliffs, destroy the guns, and hold the position until reinforcements arrived from Omaha Beach. The reality was far less forgiving. The cliffs were 100 feet high, sheer and slippery. The tides were treacherous. The Germans above were well-armed and alert, yet Rudder's men trained for it, day after day on the southern coast of England. Climbing ropes, firing grappling hooks, storming mock fortifications built from scaffolding. They knew it could not be done easily. Some said it could not be done at all. Rudder himself admitted it was a 50-50 chance at best. Still, orders were orders. Pointe du Hoc had to fall, because as long as those guns could fire, D-Day itself could not succeed. And so as the German soldiers at the strongpoint brewed their morning coffee and looked out upon what they thought was an empty sea, hundreds of Rangers were already en route toward them, packed into small wooden landing craft, bouncing through waves taller than the boats themselves. They carried ropes, ladders, grenades, and determination. But no illusions. The strongpoint above the sea stood ready, but for the first time since it was built, its defenders would soon discover what it meant to face an enemy who did not believe in impossible walls. For months before D-Day, the men at Pointe du Hoc had waited. Each day began the same way: gray light over gray water, the wind rising from the sea, the cry of gulls lost in the surf. The monotony gnawed at them. It was said among the soldiers that the war had forgotten this place. The Atlantic Wall had been Hitler's great boast, but in practice much of it was unfinished, even here. At a supposedly impregnable fortress, supplies were short, the men were underfed, the fortifications incomplete, and the artillery, once the pride of the strongpoint, had been moved inland in early spring. Officially, it was to protect the guns from bombing raids. Unofficially, it was because Berlin had no replacements if they were lost. To keep up appearances, the engineers installed wooden decoys in the casemates. They looked convincing from the air. The same length, the same profile, but up close they were nothing more than logs painted black. Only a handful of men in the garrison knew the truth. To the rest, the illusion was comforting. The fort still felt invincible. The weeks passed with little to mark them. Patrols scouted the beaches below. Civilians from nearby villages came and went. Farmers forced to labor under German control. Every few days, supply trucks rattled up the narrow road from Grand Camp, bringing rations, mail, and rumors. The men had grown used to talk of invasion. It came and went like the tide. The British, they said, were too cautious. The Americans too inexperienced. And the weather, the eternal ally, would always hold them back. Some of the younger soldiers, restless for action, imagined what an invasion might look like. They would picture the sea full of ships, thousands of men pouring ashore. And then, inevitably, they would laugh. The cliffs were too high, the defenses too strong. Even if the enemy tried, he would be crushed long before reaching the top. Still, small signs of unease crept in. Allied bombers became more frequent, their routes more deliberate. On clear nights, the men could see the orange glow of explosions to the east. Where Caen and Bayeux burned, one evening in early June, The officers gathered to discuss reports from naval observers. Enemy ships massing along the English coast. Some said it was an exercise, others weren't so sure. Obergefreiter Rettig was among those who refused to believe the invasion would come here. He wrote in his diary, one of the few personal accounts to survive the battle, that the mood among his comrades was weary, not anxious. "We have been told to expect them," he wrote. "But they will not come. This coast is madness for an attack. Perhaps Calais, perhaps Cherbourg, but not here." On June 5th, the wind howled without pause. Rain lashed the bunkers and the sea raged below. Many men spent the night in their quarters, playing cards, drinking weak coffee, and cursing the endless cold. The officers assured them no fleet could possibly cross in such weather. They slept fitfully, soothed by the certainty that another false alarm had passed. When dawn came, it was calmer. The wind had dropped. A pale mist hung over the cliffs at 6 o'clock. The telephone rang. Reports of enemy ships on the horizon. The duty officer dismissed it as hysteria. But within an hour, the truth was undeniable. The horizon had changed shape. The fog was alive with motion. At first, the men thought it was a mirage. Then they saw it clearly. A black line stretching from east to west, shimmering under the rising sun. And beneath it, the low rumble of engines. The invasion that had never come, the one they had stopped believing in, had arrived. Within minutes, orders rippled through the bunkers. Ammunition was distributed. The artillery observers took their positions. Men ran to their guns, their laughter gone. Replaced by a cold focus, they did not yet know what kind of enemy they faced, only that he was coming in numbers beyond imagination. And as the great fleet drew closer, the first shells began to fall, and the waiting ended forever. At 6:30 in the morning, the horizon itself began to move. What had once been a calm gray line between sky and sea now boiled with motion. Ships upon ships, stretching as far as the eye could follow. From the observation post at Pointe du Hoc, it looked impossible to comprehend. The air seemed to vibrate with the sound of engines, the low thunder of thousands of propellers cutting the waves. Obergefreiter Colonel Rettig stood in the trench line, binoculars pressed hard to his eyes. Straining against the morning glare, the fog was thinning now. Burned away by the first touch of sunlight, through the mist, he could make out the dark shapes of warships, destroyers, cruisers, battleships, each one bristling with guns. Between them darted smaller craft, 100 different kinds moving with purpose and speed. "This is it," someone whispered behind him. The officers shouted orders, spotters called bearings. Artillerymen adjusted range tables and telephones screamed with static. Word came from the coastal command near Grand Camp. The entire Channel coast was under attack. From Utah to Sword, the Allies had come ashore. The invasion of France had begun, but at Pointe du Hoc, no landing craft approached yet. Instead, the fleet seemed to shift its attention toward them. A new sound rolled across the sea, deeper, sharper, the whistle of heavy shells cutting through air. Then came the first impact. The headland erupted. Naval gunfire slammed into the cliffs with apocalyptic force. The ground convulsed. The air thickened with dust and smoke. Concrete shattered. Stones screamed as they tore free from the cliffs. The men in the bunkers clung to the walls, their ears ringing, mouths filled with grit. Rettig felt the earth move beneath him. Each explosion felt closer than the last, a constant, rhythmic pounding. The naval guns fired in perfect sequence, their shells landing with mathematical precision. In those moments, even the most hardened soldiers felt a flicker of doubt. If this was just the beginning, how could anything survive what came next? The bombardment went on for over half an hour. Some accounts say longer. The noise was beyond measure, a continuous roar that seemed to consume the world. The defenders could not see, could barely breathe. The telephone lines were cut, orders stopped coming. The only light came from the flames flickering at the cliff edge, the orange glow of shattered bunkers. When the shelling finally eased, the silence was worse than the noise. It felt unnatural, fragile, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. Rettig stepped out of the bunker into the smoky air. The landscape was unrecognizable, a moonscape of craters, splintered wire and burning debris. The trenches had collapsed in places. The casemates cracked open like broken eggs. The proud fortress above the sea was bleeding concrete and fire, and yet incredibly men still lived among the ruins. From the wreckage emerged figures covered in dust, coughing, shouting to one another. A machine gun nest reassembled its tripod. Mortar teams checked their weapons. The training took over, automatic, precise, even in chaos. Then someone shouted, Booty! Boote im Wasser! Boats in the water down below through the drifting haze. Dark shapes moved toward the cliffs, small landing craft. Bobbing violently in the surf, they were hard to see, half hidden by smoke and spray, but they were there, dozens of them. The first instinct among the defenders was disbelief. No one could be insane enough to attempt a landing here. The cliffs were sheer, the surf brutal, the tide against them, but the shapes kept coming, and the reality was undeniable. Through his binoculars, Rudder saw men inside the craft, small figures packed shoulder to shoulder, helmets gleaming with seawater. Each boat carried perhaps 20 or 30 of them. Some waved flags or signaled with lights. Others crouched low, gripping ropes and ladders. For a heartbeat, time seemed to stop. The sea, the cliffs, the men, all frozen in that impossible moment between certainty and realization. Then, with terrifying clarity, it began. The landing craft surged forward, lowering their ramps into the waves. Men leapt into the surf, waist deep, then chest deep. Dragged by the current, some stumbled. Others disappeared beneath the water. But still they came. They ran toward the base of the cliff, burdened with ropes, rocket launchers, grenades and faith. The Germans opened fire. Machine guns thundered from the embrasures, their tracers stitching bright red lines across the air. Mortars thumped, grenades tumbled down the cliff face. The sea turned white with foam and smoke, yet through it all, the American Rangers pressed on from above. It looked suicidal, men flung against the impossible, climbing where no one should climb. But to the defenders watching, something about it was terrifying. There was no hesitation, no retreat. Even as the ropes caught fire, even as ladders splintered under gunfire, new ones appeared. The enemy would not stop. By 7:15, the impossible had become real. The horizon had moved, and now so had the war. The Rangers had launched from their motherships hours earlier, in the pre-dawn darkness. Their small British-built landing craft, called LCAs, had been lowered into the rough sea far off the coast. The wind was fierce, the tide higher than expected. Each man carried more than 70 pounds of gear, rifles, grenades, climbing ropes, Bangalore torpedoes, and blocks of explosives for destroying the guns above. Their mission was brutally clear. Scale the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc, destroy the heavy guns threatening the beaches, and hold the high ground until reinforcements arrived. It was a task that every military planner had deemed nearly impossible, but Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder, commander of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, had accepted it with quiet resolve. In the gray light before dawn, as the boats pitched and rolled in heavy seas, many of his men vomited from the motion, others prayed quietly. Gripping their ropes with white knuckles, they could hear the distant thunder of the naval bombardment, the same shells that now shook the cliffs. Some cheered it, thinking it would flatten the defenses. Others feared it would leave them nothing but rubble to climb. At 6:39, the signal flares fired from the fleet, the order to advance. The armada surged toward the shore. Spray lashed the men's faces. The roar of engines drowned all thought. Several craft drifted off course in the strong current. One boat, carrying a group from Company D, was swept miles east and landed near Omaha Beach instead. But the others pressed on toward Pointe du Hoc, aiming for the narrow strip of shingle at the base of the cliff. The German guns were already awake. Shells from the coastal batteries landed around them, throwing geysers of water into the air. Shrapnel ripped through the waves, yet the Rangers kept going, their coxswains shouting over the din. "Hold fast!" 30 seconds. The first boats hit the shore at 7 o'clock. The ramps crashed down. The men jumped into waist-deep water, dragging ropes and ladders behind them. Their boots sank into the sand as bullets tore through the surf. The noise was deafening. Machine gun fire from above. Explosions from mortars and grenades. The hiss of rockets launching their grapnels upward. From the German perspective, it looked insane, through the smoke. They saw men firing ropes by rocket into the cliffs, then beginning to climb. Hand over hand under fire, some ropes were cut, sending climbers plunging into the sea. Others caught and held. Wooden ladders from broken boats were hoisted up and used as makeshift scaling frames. Every few seconds, another man fell, but those behind stepped over him and kept climbing. The Rangers' equipment worked only partly as planned. Many of the ropes were soaked and heavy. Some rockets misfired, grappling hooks failed to catch, or tore loose under weight. The men relied on sheer strength, fingers gripping cracks, boots scraping for purchase on the slick stone. At the base of the cliff, Sergeant Leonard Bud Lomel of D Company found himself staring upward, watching the rope sway under machine gun fire. For a second, he would later recall, it didn't look possible. But we didn't come this far to stop looking. Above him, German defenders leaned out of their bunkers, throwing grenades and pouring rifle fire down. Flames licked the ropes where tracer rounds struck. Still, the climbers kept coming in one corner of the cliff. A ranger named Jack Coon began firing his Thompson submachine gun one-handed as he climbed with the other, the recoil nearly throwing him backward nearby. Another ranger cut his own hand open on the rock, wrapped it in a strip of torn uniform, and kept going. After 15 minutes of climbing, the first rangers reached the top. They pulled themselves over the lip, gasping for air, soaked and bloodied. The Germans met them with bayonets and grenades, but the rangers moved fast, too fast for the defenders to reorganize. Within moments, more men reached the summit, spreading out into small assault teams. From below, Rettig could hardly believe what he saw. The Americans were on the cliffs. The unthinkable had happened. His comrades fired furiously, trying to drive them back. But the high ground had been breached. By 7:45, nearly 200 rangers had scaled Pointe du Hoc behind them. The sea was littered with wrecked boats and burning fuel. Ahead of them lay the shattered ruins of the strong point. Their radios barely worked, their ranks were thinned. But they were alive, and they had done the impossible. As the smoke thickened and the wind shifted, the battle for Pointe du Hoc was no longer about the climb. It was about what waited beyond, in the trenches, the bunkers, and the labyrinth of fire that crowned the cliff. And for the defenders, the question was no longer whether the Americans could reach them. It was how long they could hold before everything fell apart. From above, it had looked absurd. From below, it had felt like suicide. Yet there they were, soaked, bleeding, exhausted, standing on the very summit the Germans had called untouchable. For the Rangers, the climb itself was not a battle. It was an act of defiance against nature and the enemy alike. An assault on gravity, on fear, and on the very idea of impossible. Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder, now on the cliff himself, struggled to make sense of the chaos. His command boat had landed late, driven off course by the current. Many of his men had already scaled the cliffs by the time he arrived. Smoke and debris made it impossible to tell friend from foe. Radios were clogged with static, and the prearranged signals to the fleet failed completely. The Rangers were on their own. The defenders, dazed from the bombardment, tried to regroup. German machine guns in the northern casemates opened up again, sweeping the cratered ground. Mortar crews, hidden behind shattered concrete, began firing blindly toward movement. From the bunkers came bursts of rifle fire, but the Rangers, moving in small teams, fought like ghosts, darting through the smoke, firing from unexpected angles, lobbing grenades into firing slits and disappearing again. They had trained for this, for confusion, for isolation, for the moment when plans dissolved and instinct took over. Every ranger carried a small map, a compass, and explosives. Their orders were simple: find the guns, destroy them, and hold. The summit of Pointe du Hoc no longer resembled Earth. The naval bombardment had turned it into a maze of craters and twisted rebar. Trenches were collapsed, bunkers shattered, communication lines severed, smoke poured from the cracked casemates. Even the defenders seemed stunned by the scale of the destruction. In the confusion, some German positions were bypassed entirely. Others were assaulted at close range. Brutal, point-blank fights fought with grenades, knives, and bayonets. Rangers kicked open bunker doors, cleared them room by room. The smell of cordite and burnt concrete filled the air. By 8 o'clock, the Rangers had secured most of the clifftop. But something was wrong. The great artillery guns they had come to destroy, the ones that had justified this suicidal mission, were nowhere to be found. The casemates were empty. Rudder sent patrols racing across the headland. They found only wooden dummies, carved from logs and painted black to fool Allied reconnaissance. The realization was like a punch to the gut. They had risked everything, lost dozens of men, and the guns, the entire reason for the assault, were missing. But Ranger training taught them to adapt, not despair. Patrols fanned out beyond the strong point, moving inland through fields still shrouded in smoke. It was here that two men, Sergeant Leonard Bud Lomel and Staff Sergeant Jack Coon, made the discovery that would change the course of the invasion. They found the real guns less than 1,000 yards inland, hidden under camouflage netting along a dirt road. The weapons were fully operational, each pointed toward Utah Beach, their range cards prepared. And though the crews were momentarily absent, likely sheltering from the bombardment, the guns were ready to fire. Lomel and Coon knew they had minutes, maybe seconds, before the crews returned. They sprinted forward, planted thermite grenades in the mechanisms, and melted the breech blocks. Then they moved to the next gun, and the next, destroying each in turn. Within minutes, all 6 were disabled. No signal was sent to London, no fanfare, no announcement. But in that quiet act, 2 men with grenades in a French field. The fire that could have annihilated thousands on the beaches below was extinguished. Back on the cliff, the Germans counterattacked. Small groups of infantry pushed from the east, probing the Ranger perimeter. Snipers fired from ruined observation posts. Ammunition began to run low. Rudder's men dug in, using craters and collapsed trenches as cover. Their radios were broken. Their promised reinforcements delayed by the chaos on Omaha Beach. For nearly 2 days they would hold out alone, surrounded and outnumbered. Against repeated attacks to the Germans, it still seemed unreal. These few dozen Americans, clinging to a wrecked hilltop, refusing to yield to the Rangers. It was the fulfillment of something larger than courage, a duty born from trust, from the belief that the impossible could be done, and that the cost was worth paying. By noon, the smoke began to thin. The sea below was still littered with wreckage, the cliffs blackened with burn marks, and high above, against all odds, the stars and stripes now fluttered in the wind. The impossible climb was over. The battle for survival was only beginning. By afternoon, the headland was an inferno. Every trench, every crater, every shattered bunker was alive with fire and gunfire. The Rangers held barely 200 yards of ground, a patchwork of broken earth and smoking ruins. But to them it was everything. The Germans, realizing the Americans had seized the cliff, launched counterattacks from both east and west. Infantry from the 352nd Division, supported by machine guns and mortars, advanced across the open fields. They knew the terrain well. They had rehearsed defensive drills here for months. But they had not prepared for an enemy this stubborn. The Rangers fought from the ground, from shell holes, from whatever cover remained. Their rifles were caked with dirt, their hands blistered from climbing and digging. Many had lost their helmets. Ammunition ran low. Food and water were almost gone, but they refused to give an inch. In the maze of trenches that snaked across Pointe du Hoc, combat became intimate and merciless. Men fired point-blank across corners, hurled grenades into dugouts, stabbed with bayonets when the chambers clicked empty. One Ranger later recalled, "It wasn't battle anymore, it was survival." You could smell fear, cordite, and blood all mixed together. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder crawled from crater to crater, organizing defenses, encouraging men who had been awake for 30 hours. A sniper's bullet grazed his leg, but he refused evacuation. He knew the reinforcements from Omaha Beach were delayed, pinned down by machine gun fire of their own. The Rangers here were isolated, surrounded by hundreds of Germans determined to erase them. At dusk, the sky turned crimson from fire still burning in the destroyed bunkers. The sound of the sea below mixed with the cries of the wounded. The men patched one another up with torn shirts and field dressings. Some German soldiers, wounded and dazed, stumbled into Ranger lines and were taken prisoner. They looked as shocked as the Americans. Neither side could quite believe this fight was happening here. On a cliff once deemed invincible, as night fell, artillery from both sides continued to pound the headland. Shells screamed overhead, explosions lighting up the darkness like lightning. The Rangers dug deeper, reinforced their positions, and rationed what little ammunition remained. They were exhausted, soaked, and starving, but they held below them. The great invasion rolled on. Omaha Beach was a slaughterhouse. Utah fared better, but everywhere along the coast, the Allies were pushing inland. The Germans at Pointe du Hoc had expected to repel the invaders with their big guns. Instead, those guns lay silent, melted wrecks hidden in a field. At midnight, the Germans attacked again. Dozens of them advanced through the smoke, shouting, hurling grenades into the trenches. The fighting was hand-to-hand, brutal and desperate in the confusion. One German squad briefly retook part of the northern trench. Rangers counterattacked immediately. Grenades first, then rifles, then knives. By dawn, the line held. When the sun rose on June 7th, the survivors could finally see the full devastation. The headland was unrecognizable, a landscape of ruin. Out of the 225 men who had landed at the base of the cliff, fewer than 90 remained able to fight. Still, they refused to retreat. Rudder radioed the fleet. Mission accomplished, guns destroyed. Need ammunition and reinforcements. The message was brief, understated, almost calm, but its significance was enormous. Those words meant that the artillery which could have annihilated the invasion beaches had been silenced. Pointe du Hoc had fallen, not to overwhelming numbers, but to sheer will, as the morning light washed over the ruined fortress. The Germans launched one final attack, then broke off, realizing the position was lost. For the men who survived, it was not victory they felt, but something quieter, deeper, exhaustion, relief, and the heavy understanding that they had witnessed the hinge of history turn, not in some grand strategy meeting or sweeping armored offensive, but in the mud of a trench with fire all around. The fortress above the sea had become a graveyard, and from its fall, D-Day had found its foothold. By the morning of June 8, 1944, the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc were silent. Smoke still drifted upward from the shattered bunkers, twisting into the pale French sky. The air smelled of salt and ash, oil and blood. Gulls wheeled above the headland, circling lazily, as if surveying a landscape too quiet for what it had endured. The sound of war had moved inland now, toward the hedgerows, the towns, the next battles to come, but here, on this once proud fortress, the war had already written its verdict. When reinforcements from the 116th Infantry finally reached the Rangers on the morning of June 8th, what they found was less a garrison than a miracle. Less than 90 Rangers still stood, hollow-eyed, caked with soot, their uniforms torn to rags. Some had fought for 48 hours without sleep. Others lay wounded in shell craters, wrapped in blankets or pieces of canvas, waiting for medics who never came. Yet they were still at their posts, rifles in hand, watching the horizon, unwilling to abandon the ground they had bled for. The German garrison of Pointe du Hoc had ceased to exist. Some defenders had been killed during the bombardment, others captured or scattered during the chaos. A few survivors from the 352nd Infantry slipped away under the cover of darkness, retreating toward the interior, dazed and broken. For them, the fall of this headland was more than a defeat. It was the collapse of an illusion, the death of the idea that any wall, however high or strong, could stop the tide of war forever. When the American flag was raised over Pointe du Hoc that morning, it fluttered weakly in the wind, half torn, stained with soot. There was no cheering, no grand ceremony, only weary men standing amid ruins, watching the sea that had delivered them. To them, victory was not triumph. It was survival. From Berlin, the news was met with disbelief. The Führer had been told the Atlantic Wall was unbreakable. His generals had assured him that the cliffs of Normandy were impregnable. But the reports from the front were undeniable. The Allies were ashore, their fleet was unbroken, their air power ruled the skies, and the fortress above the sea, the very symbol of Germany's western defense, had fallen, not to an army, but to a few hundred men who refused to give up. What those in Berlin could not grasp, what those on the cliffs now understood, was that the fall of Pointe du Hoc was not simply the loss of a position. It was the breaking of a myth for 4 years. German propaganda had promised that technology, engineering, and iron will could build a wall strong enough to contain the world. But on these cliffs, men had proven that courage and determination could climb even the impossible. When historians would later walk this ground, they would find it hard to believe anyone had fought here at all. The soil was churned to dust, the bunkers collapsed, the trenches filled with rubble. The cliffs still bore the black scars of fire, yet beneath that ruin, they would uncover the traces of that fight. The ropes still dangling from the rocks, rusted helmets half buried in sand, bullet holes peppering the concrete casemates. The story they told was not of victory alone, but of defiance, the kind that transcends tactics and strategy. For the Rangers, the cost was staggering. Of the 225 who began the climb, more than half were dead, wounded, or missing. Many of the fallen were never found, their names recorded only in reports and memorials. But every man who survived carried the memory of those cliffs for the rest of his life. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder would later say that Pointe du Hoc was the longest day of our lives. He would limp for years from the wound he received there. But he spoke of his men with reverence, not regret. They did what they were told, he said simply. And more than that, they made the impossible possible. The world would remember that phrase, though history would nearly forget how fragile victory felt in those first moments. For even as the Rangers stood victorious, the beaches behind them still burned. Omaha was littered with the wreckage of the first assault. Bodies, twisted metal, shattered landing craft. Utah was scarred but secure. Beyond them stretched the long road to Paris, to the Rhine, to Berlin itself. The war was far from over. But the foothold had been won. In the decades that followed, the wind would reclaim Pointe du Hoc. Grass would grow through the craters, wildflowers through the wire. The sea, indifferent to memory, would keep pounding the cliffs as it always had. Visitors would come, soldiers, historians, sons, and daughters, standing where men once climbed under fire. The echoes of that morning would remain, the crash of surf, the thunder of guns, the whispered disbelief of the defenders who watched the impossible unfold. And perhaps if one listens closely enough on a quiet dawn, the ghosts of that day still speak, not in words, but in the sound of the sea against stone, reminding us of what was done here. Because at Pointe du Hoc, something changed forever. The fortress that was meant to guard tyranny became the place where freedom found its first foothold in occupied Europe. The Germans had called it invincible. Göring had laughed, saying, "If they ever appear, you may call me Meyer." And appear they did. Men who refused to believe in the impossible, who climbed through fire and steel to change the course of history. When the sun set over Normandy that night, the flag still waved above the cliffs, tattered but unbroken, like the men who raised it. And from that narrow edge of France, the liberation of a continent had begun. The high ground had fallen, and with it so too fell the illusion of invincibility, replaced forever by the truth of courage.